Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through history's most uncomfortable truths. Tonight we're exploring the supposedly glamorous world of medieval knighthood, where chivalry was a marketing scam and being a professional warrior meant a lifetime of debt, discomfort, and creative ways to die while wearing 60 pounds of metal. Before we saddle up for this tour through chivalric nightmares, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy falling asleep to tales of historical suffering, and subscribe only if you genuinely want more content about why the past was terrible even for the people who supposedly had it good. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining me for these midnight reality checks. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack that wasn't eaten while wearing a helmet that blocked your vision, and let's explore why being a medieval knight was less like being a noble hero and more like being a very expensive target practice dummy with anger management issues. Chapter 1: The Crushing Weight of Chivalry. Medieval knighthood was essentially a pyramid scheme where young men bankrupted their families to join an exclusive club of professional killers who spent most of their time trying not to get killed by other professional killers. The romantic image of knights as noble heroes was medieval propaganda designed to make organized violence seem virtuous. Full-plate armor weighed between 50 to 60 pounds and was custom-fitted to each knight, which sounds impressive until you realize it meant wearing a personal oven that turned every physical activity into an endurance test. Knights couldn't put on their armor alone, couldn't get up if they fell down, and couldn't perform basic bodily functions without assistance. It was like wearing a very expensive iron straitjacket. The cost of knightly equipment was astronomical. A full set of armor, weapons, and a proper warhorse could cost more than a small village was worth. Most knights went into debt to afford their gear, then spent their careers trying to earn enough through violence to pay off their equipment loans. It was medieval military financing with interest rates enforced by sword point. Training began in childhood and was essentially a 15-year program of systematic child abuse designed to produce adults who were comfortable with violence and immune to empathy. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 to serve as pages, learning to clean armor, care for weapons, and absorb physical punishment without complaint. This was considered character building rather than child endangerment. The chivalric code was a set of impossible contradictions that required knights to be simultaneously brutal killers and gentle protectors, devout Christians and professional warriors, humble servants and proud nobles. Following these contradictory rules was psychologically impossible, creating internal conflicts that drove many knights to alcoholism, violence, or religious extremism. Social expectations demanded that knights maintain appearances of wealth and status even when they were broke and desperate. A knight who couldn't afford proper equipment, fine clothing, and generous hospitality would lose social standing and military opportunities. This created a cycle where knights had to spend money they didn't have to maintain the illusion of prosperity necessary for their careers. Religious justification for knighthood required knights to believe they were serving God by killing people, which created cognitive dissonance that was resolved through elaborate rationalizations about just war and divine will. The Church blessed weapons designed to kill Christians, creating a theological framework that turned murder into holy work. Political manipulation was constant as knights served lords who used them as chess pieces in complex power games. Knights were expected to die for their lord's ambitions while receiving minimal compensation and no guarantee that their families would be cared for if they didn't return from campaign. Loyalty was a one-way street paved with knight corpses. Tournament culture created additional financial pressures, as knights were expected to participate in expensive competitions that served as military training, social networking, and entertainment for nobles who bet on the outcomes. Losing tournaments meant loss of prestige and prize money, while winning meant having to defend your reputation against increasingly desperate challengers. Marriage prospects for knights were determined by economics rather than affection, with families negotiating alliances based on military utility and land holdings. Knights married for political advantage and financial necessity, creating relationships that were business partnerships rather than romantic unions. Love was considered irrelevant to knightly marriages. Career advancement required knights to distinguish themselves in combat, which meant actively seeking dangerous situations where they could prove their worth by risking their lives. The most successful knights were often the most psychologically damaged, as surviving medieval warfare required suppressing normal human responses to violence and death. The knightly class existed to serve the interests of kings and nobles who used them to maintain power through violence while providing just enough social status and economic opportunity to keep them loyal. Knights were essentially expensive mercenaries with better PR and fancier equipment. Chapter 2: Combat Reality versus Hollywood Fantasy. Medieval combat was nothing like the choreographed sword fights in movies. It was brief, brutal, and usually decided by whoever made fewer mistakes or had better equipment. Knights spent years training for moments of violence that were terrifying, exhausting, and often fatal despite all their preparation and protection. Sword fighting was actually quite rare in medieval combat because swords were expensive and relatively ineffective against armor. Most knights carried swords as status symbols but fought with weapons designed to crush or pierce armor. Maces, war hammers, and specialized polearms that could punch through metal or deliver concussive blows that killed through internal injuries. Mounted combat required knights to control a warhorse with their legs while managing weapons, shields, and armor that limited their vision and mobility. Horses were trained for combat but were also targets, and a knight whose horse was killed would find himself on the ground in heavy armor, surrounded by enemies who could kill him at their leisure. Battle formations broke down quickly in medieval combat as individual knights became separated from their units and found themselves fighting for survival rather than following tactical plans. Most battles devolved into chaotic melees where knights tried to stay alive long enough to either kill their opponents or surrender for ransom. Weapons maintenance was a constant concern as medieval metallurgy produced weapons that dulled, chipped, or broke under combat stress. Knights needed backup weapons and regular access to skilled blacksmiths to keep their equipment functional. Fighting with damaged weapons was often fatal, but replacement weapons were expensive and not always available. Armor effectiveness varied dramatically based on quality, fit, and maintenance. Cheap armor could be penetrated by determined attacks, while even the finest armor had gaps and weak points that skilled opponents could exploit. Knights trusted their lives to equipment that was only as good as the craftsman who made it and the squire who maintained it. Ransom economics created perverse incentives where wealthy knights were valuable alive but poor knights were worth more dead. This meant that combat outcomes were often determined by the perceived economic value of participants rather than martial skill or courage. Rich knights might survive battles that killed their poorer companions. Cavalry charges were the signature knightly tactic, designed to break enemy formations through shock and momentum. These charges were effective when they worked but left knights isolated and vulnerable if they failed. A failed charge meant being surrounded by infantry who could attack horses and dismounted knights with impunity. Siege warfare was particularly miserable for knights who found themselves trapped in castles or camps for months while disease, hunger, and enemy attacks slowly killed defenders and attackers alike. Knights were trained for open combat but spent much of their military service in siege conditions that negated their tactical advantages. Battle injuries from medieval weapons were horrific and often fatal despite armor protection. Blunt force trauma from maces and hammers could kill through internal bleeding without penetrating armor, while arrows and crossbow bolts could find gaps in protection and cause infections that killed days or weeks after battles ended. Medical treatment for combat injuries was primitive and often counterproductive. Battlefield medicine consisted of crude bandaging and prayer, with seriously injured knights dying from blood loss, infection, or shock. Surviving serious wounds often meant permanent disability that ended knightly careers and left families destitute. Post-combat trauma affected many knights who survived multiple battles but struggled with what we would now recognize as PTSD. Medieval medicine had no understanding of psychological injuries, so knights dealing with trauma self-medicated with alcohol or channeled their suffering into religious extremism or increased violence. Chapter 3: The Economics of Professional Violence. Knighthood was essentially an expensive military career that required enormous upfront investments with no guarantee of return. Knights were independent contractors in the medieval military-industrial complex, responsible for their own equipment, training, and financial survival, while serving lords who viewed them as expendable assets. Equipment costs consumed most knights' incomes and inheritances. A warhorse alone could cost as much as a small farm, and knights needed multiple horses for different purposes: destriers for combat, palfreys for travel, and pack horses for carrying equipment. Each horse required feed, care, and replacement when injured or killed, creating ongoing expenses that many knights couldn't afford. Weapons and armor required constant maintenance and periodic replacement as technology advanced and equipment wore out. Knights needed access to skilled craftsmen who could repair damage and upgrade equipment to meet evolving battlefield requirements. This created dependency relationships with blacksmiths and armorers who could bankrupt knights with their fees. Military campaigns rarely provided adequate compensation for knightly service. Lords expected knights to serve for honor and feudal obligation rather than cash payment, while campaigns often lasted longer than planned and cost more than anticipated. Knights returned from successful campaigns poorer than when they left, having spent their own money to serve their lord's interests. Ransoming prisoners was theoretically a major source of knightly income, but it required capturing wealthy opponents who could pay substantial ransoms. Most combat encounters involved killing rather than capturing enemies, and ransom payments were often delayed, reduced, or simply never paid by families who claimed poverty or disputed the terms. Tournament winnings were unreliable income sources that required knights to risk injury and death while paying entry fees and travel expenses. Successful tournament champions could earn prize money and valuable equipment, but most participants lost more money than they won while suffering injuries that ended their careers. Land grants from lords were supposed to provide knightly income through feudal obligations, but many grants consisted of poor land that produced minimal income or land that was disputed and difficult to control. Knights might spend years fighting to secure their granted lands only to discover that the income was insufficient to support their military obligations. Debt financing was common among knights who borrowed money to purchase equipment, maintain their households, and fund their military service. Interest rates were high and repayment terms were strict, creating debt spirals that forced knights to take increasingly dangerous military contracts to generate the income needed to service their loans. Family finances were often ruined by knightly careers that consumed generational wealth without producing adequate returns. Families mortgaged their lands and sold their possessions to support knightly sons who might die in their first battle, leaving the family impoverished with no assets and substantial debts. Economic competition between knights created a military arms race where each innovation in equipment or tactics forced other knights to spend money on upgrades or risk becoming obsolete. This constant pressure to maintain military competitiveness prevented knights from accumulating wealth or achieving financial security. Retirement planning was non-existent for knights whose careers could end suddenly through injury, death, or political changes. Knights who survived long enough to become too old for combat often found themselves without resources to support themselves, dependent on family charity or church welfare for survival. Social obligations required knights to maintain expensive lifestyles that demonstrated their status and attracted military opportunities. Knights needed fine clothing, quality horses, skilled servants, and generous hospitality to maintain their reputation in knightly society. These social expenses often exceeded knights' military income. Chapter 4: Training from Hell, Creating Professional Killers. The process of creating a medieval knight began in early childhood and involved 15 years of systematic conditioning designed to produce adults who were comfortable with violence, loyal to authority, and psychologically equipped to kill other human beings for money. This training process was child abuse disguised as education. Page training started at age 7 when boys were taken from their families and placed in the households of nobles who were responsible for their education and conditioning. These children became household servants who cleaned armor, cared for weapons, and performed manual labor while learning the basics of knightly culture through observation and punishment. Physical conditioning involved constant training with heavy weapons and equipment designed to build strength and endurance. Young pages practiced sword work with weighted training weapons, learned to manage horses much larger than themselves, and performed exercises designed to prepare them for the physical demands of wearing armor and fighting in it. Psychological conditioning was designed to suppress natural empathy and fear while promoting aggression and loyalty. Boys were exposed to violence, taught to view enemies as subhuman, and punished for showing weakness or compassion. This conditioning created adults who could kill without hesitation but often struggled with normal human relationships. Educational neglect was systematic as knightly training focused entirely on military skills while ignoring literacy, mathematics, and other intellectual pursuits. Most knights remained functionally illiterate throughout their lives, dependent on clergy and administrators for any tasks requiring reading or writing. This intellectual limitation made knights easy to manipulate by more educated superiors. Squire training began around age 14 and involved direct participation in combat preparation and battlefield support. Squires accompanied knights into battle, maintained their equipment, and learned combat techniques through direct experience of medieval warfare's realities. This exposure to violence at a formative age caused lasting psychological damage. Combat instruction emphasized techniques for killing other human beings as efficiently as possible. Squires learned where to strike to penetrate armor, how to kill fallen opponents, and how to extract maximum damage from their weapons. This training normalized extreme violence and taught young men to view killing as a professional skill rather than a moral issue. Religious indoctrination was used to justify the violence that knights were trained to commit. Young men were taught that killing was acceptable when done in service to God, Lord, or honor, creating religious frameworks that allowed them to reconcile their actions with Christian teachings about murder and violence. Social conditioning separated knights from common people by teaching them that their noble birth and military training made them inherently superior to peasants and merchants. This class conditioning made knights view ordinary people as expendable resources rather than fellow human beings deserving of protection and respect. Loyalty conditioning created absolute obedience to feudal superiors through a combination of personal bonds, economic dependence, and threats of punishment. Knights were trained to follow orders without question, even when those orders required them to commit acts they might personally find objectionable. Pain tolerance training involved deliberate infliction of suffering designed to prepare knights for the physical trauma of combat. Young men were beaten, injured, and exposed to discomfort until they developed psychological mechanisms for functioning despite pain. This conditioning created adults who were functional but emotionally damaged. Moral desensitization was achieved through gradual exposure to violence and killing, starting with animals and progressing to human opponents. This systematic desensitization created adults who could commit acts of extreme violence without experiencing normal psychological responses like guilt, empathy, or trauma. Competition conditioning created knights who viewed other men as threats to be defeated rather than potential allies or friends. This competitive mindset made cooperation difficult and created social environments characterized by constant conflict and rivalry rather than mutual support. Chapter 5: Castle Life. Medieval Military Bases. Medieval castles were not romantic fairy tale residences but military fortifications designed to project power through intimidation while providing their inhabitants with all the comfort and privacy of a medieval prison. Life in a castle was cold, dark, uncomfortable, and socially oppressive for everyone from the lord to the lowest servant. Castle architecture prioritized defense over comfort, creating buildings that were essentially stone bunkers with minimal windows, poor ventilation, and no heating except for smoky fireplaces that filled rooms with toxic fumes. The walls were thick enough to resist siege weapons but also thick enough to block sunlight and retain cold moisture that made castles perpetually damp and chilly. Living quarters were cramped and shared, with even wealthy knights having little privacy or personal space. Multiple people shared beds, rooms, and facilities in arrangements that would be considered overcrowded by modern standards. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist in castle life, where every activity was observed and discussed by other residents. Sanitation was primitive and disgusting, with castle toilets consisting of holes in walls that dropped waste into moats or pits below. These latrines were cold, smelly, and dangerous, with people occasionally falling through and drowning in sewage. The smell of human waste permeated castle life, making every meal and social interaction an olfactory nightmare. Food quality was poor despite the castle's wealth and resources. Meals consisted of bread, meat, and ale with minimal variety or nutritional balance. Food was often spoiled, heavily salted, or contaminated with insects and rodents that infested castle storage areas. Dining was a survival challenge disguised as hospitality. Heating systems were ineffective and dangerous, relying on open fires that consumed enormous amounts of wood while providing minimal warmth. Castle residents spent their days cold and their nights colder, huddled around fires that filled rooms with smoke while leaving most areas unheated. Hypothermia was a constant threat during winter months. Lighting was provided by candles and oil lamps that were expensive to maintain and created fire hazards in buildings constructed primarily of wood and cloth. Most castle activities took place in dim or dark conditions, with residents going to bed shortly after sunset and waking before dawn to maximize use of natural light. Water supply was often contaminated and always limited, with castles depending on wells, cisterns, or nearby streams that could be poisoned by enemies or contaminated by waste. Clean water was precious and had to be carefully rationed, while bathing was infrequent and considered unhealthy by medieval medical theories. Social hierarchy was rigid and oppressive, with every resident's life controlled by complex systems of precedence, obligation, and authority. Knights might be nobles compared to peasants, but within castle society they were often little more than expensive servants subject to their lord's whims and demands. Entertainment consisted primarily of activities related to violence and drinking, with hunting, tournaments, and combat practice serving as both recreation and military training. Social gatherings involved excessive alcohol consumption and behavioral patterns that would be considered pathological by modern standards. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded castle conditions where people shared close quarters, contaminated water, and poor sanitation. Epidemic diseases could kill significant portions of castle populations, while endemic conditions like dysentery and respiratory infections were constant health threats. Security measures made castles feel like prisons even for their inhabitants, with gates, guards, and restrictions that limited movement and created atmospheres of constant surveillance. Castle residents lived under military discipline that governed every aspect of their daily lives. Economic pressure affected even wealthy castle residents who had to maintain appearances while managing the enormous costs of castle life, military obligations, and social expectations. The lifestyle that appeared luxurious from outside was actually financially ruinous for many participants. Chapter 6. The Decline and Fall of Knighthood. Medieval knighthood was ultimately killed by technological advances and social changes that made heavy cavalry obsolete and rendered the entire knightly class economically unsustainable. The decline of knighthood was a slow-motion disaster that destroyed thousands of families who had invested everything in a military career that was becoming irrelevant. Gunpowder weapons revolutionized medieval warfare by providing common soldiers with weapons that could kill the most heavily armored knight from a safe distance. Firearms required minimal training compared to knightly combat skills and cost far less than knightly equipment, making professional warriors economically obsolete almost overnight. Pike formations of disciplined infantry proved devastatingly effective against cavalry charges that had been the foundation of knightly tactics. Swiss and German pikemen could kill horses and dismounted knights without requiring expensive equipment or years of training, demonstrating that common soldiers could defeat noble warriors through superior organization and tactics. Crossbow technology provided another ranged weapon that could penetrate knightly armor while being operated by soldiers with minimal training. Crossbows were banned by church councils as too destructive, but military necessity overcame religious objections as armies discovered they could defeat knights without matching their investments in equipment and training. Standing armies replaced feudal levies as kings discovered they could maintain more effective military forces through professional soldiers who served for pay rather than feudal obligation. These armies were more disciplined, better trained, and less expensive than knightly forces that required enormous investments in equipment and maintenance. Centralized monarchies reduced the political power of knights by consolidating authority in royal hands and diminishing the importance of feudal relationships that had provided knights with their social and economic foundation. Kings preferred to rule through appointed officials rather than hereditary nobles who might challenge royal authority. Economic changes shifted wealth from land-based feudal economies to commercial systems that favored merchants and manufacturers over military aristocrats. Knights found themselves increasingly irrelevant in societies where economic power mattered more than military prowess and commercial skills were more valuable than combat abilities. Educational advances created administrative and professional classes that could provide services previously monopolized by clergy and nobility. Literacy and numeracy became more important than swordsmanship, leaving knights unprepared for careers that required intellectual rather than physical skills. Social mobility increased as commercial economies created opportunities for common people to advance through trade, crafts, and professional services rather than military service. This social change undermined knightly claims to inherent superiority based on birth and martial training. Military engineering advances in castle design and siege warfare reduced the defensive advantages that had made knights valuable as fortress garrisons and local military authorities. Star forts and artillery made medieval castles obsolete, eliminating another source of knightly employment and social relevance. Religious changes, including the Protestant Reformation, challenged the Catholic Church's support for knightly ideals and feudal hierarchy. New religious movements emphasized individual conscience and social equality rather than hereditary privilege and military virtue, undermining the ideological foundation of knighthood. Legal system development created professional courts and law enforcement that reduced the need for private military forces to maintain order and settle disputes. Knights found their traditional roles in local governance and conflict resolution taken over by trained judges and professional peace officers. The final result was that knighthood became a ceremonial title rather than a functional military role, with actual warfare conducted by professional soldiers using modern weapons and tactics. Former knights either adapted to new careers or found themselves economically and socially irrelevant in societies that no longer valued their traditional skills. Conclusion: why knighthood was medieval military disaster. As we conclude our journey through the reality of medieval knighthood, it becomes clear that the chivalric ideal was one of history's most successful marketing campaigns, convincing generations of young men to bankrupt their families and risk their lives for a career that offered minimal rewards and maximum suffering. The romanticization of knighthood in literature and popular culture has obscured the fact that most knights lived lives of economic desperation, physical discomfort, and psychological damage while serving political systems that treated them as expendable resources. The code of chivalry was a set of impossible contradictions designed to make professional killers feel noble about their work. Medieval warfare was not the glamorous adventure portrayed in movies and novels, but a series of brutal, brief encounters where survival depended more on equipment quality and luck than on skill or courage. Knights spent years training for combat experiences that were terrifying and often fatal despite their preparation and protection. The economic structure of knighthood was fundamentally unsustainable, requiring enormous investments with minimal returns while creating debt burdens that destroyed families across generations. The knightly class existed to serve the interests of rulers who provided just enough status and opportunity to maintain loyalty while extracting maximum military service for minimum compensation. Social changes and technological advances inevitably made knighthood obsolete, leaving thousands of families with obsolete skills and crushing debts acquired in pursuit of careers that were becoming irrelevant. The decline of knighthood was predictable but devastating for people who had invested everything in a military system that was being replaced by more effective and economical alternatives. Modern military forces learned from medieval mistakes by providing professional soldiers with adequate compensation, effective equipment, and realistic training, while avoiding the economic and social problems that plagued knighthood. Professional armies succeeded where feudal levies failed because they were designed to serve military rather than political purposes. So the next time you see a movie about noble knights defending justice and honor, remember that the real knights were mostly broke, uncomfortable, and psychologically damaged young men who spent their brief careers trying to avoid being killed by other broke, uncomfortable, and psychologically damaged young men in expensive metal suits. The lesson of medieval knighthood is that military careers need sustainable economic foundations and realistic social expectations to avoid becoming systems that destroy the people they claim to honor. Romance and reality rarely coincide in military history, and knighthood was no exception to this rule. Sleep well tonight, knowing that tomorrow you won't have to wear 60 pounds of armor, you won't have to mortgage your family's future to buy weapons, and nobody expects you to prove your worth by risking your life in single combat. Modern military service, for all its challenges, is far superior to the chivalric nightmare that was medieval knighthood. Chapter 7: Tournament Culture, Expensive Ways to Die for Entertainment. Medieval tournaments were essentially legalized blood sports where knights killed each other for the entertainment of nobles who bet on the outcomes, like Roman emperors watching gladiators. What started as military training evolved into a social institution that combined the worst aspects of professional sports, gambling, and public execution. Tournament economics created additional financial pressure for knights who were expected to participate in expensive competitions that could bankrupt them through entry fees, equipment costs, and travel expenses. A knight who couldn't afford tournament participation lost social standing and military opportunities, while successful tournament champions could earn prize money and valuable equipment that might keep them solvent for another season. Melee tournaments were massive free-for-all battles involving dozens of armored knights fighting with real weapons in enclosed areas. These events regularly killed participants and spectators, with casualties considered part of the entertainment value. Knights were trampled by horses, beaten to death with maces, and stabbed through gaps in their armor while crowds cheered for their favorite combatants. Jousting competitions required knights to charge directly at each other with lances while riding at full speed, attempting to knock their opponents off their horses through impact force that could easily kill. Jousting lances were designed to shatter on impact, but the force of collision often broke necks, crushed ribs, or drove wooden splinters through helmet visors into knights' brains. Tournament rules varied widely and were often ignored in the heat of combat, creating situations where supposedly controlled competitions became actual battles with real casualties. Referees had little authority over armored men wielding deadly weapons, and disputes were often settled through additional violence rather than official arbitration. Prize systems created perverse incentives where knights who killed their opponents could claim their equipment and horses as trophies, encouraging lethal rather than sporting competition. A successful tournament knight accumulated wealth by looting the bodies of defeated opponents, making tournaments into legalized murder with economic rewards for the survivors. Spectator betting transformed tournaments into gambling events where nobles wagered enormous sums on combat outcomes, while knights risked their lives to satisfy gambling debts and entertainment appetites. Knights became performing animals whose value was measured by their ability to provide exciting violence for aristocratic audiences. Social networking at tournaments was essential for knights seeking employment, marriage prospects, and political connections. But this networking required expensive displays of wealth and status that many knights couldn't afford. Tournament attendance became mandatory for career advancement, trapping knights in cycles of debt and violence. Training for tournaments required additional specialization beyond regular military skills, as tournament combat had different rules and techniques than battlefield warfare. Knights had to master both real combat and theatrical combat, doubling their training requirements while providing minimal additional military benefit. International competition attracted knights from across Europe to major tournaments, creating traveling circuits of professional fighters who spent their lives moving from tournament to tournament while accumulating injuries, debts, and psychological damage from repeated exposure to sanctioned violence. Medical casualties from tournaments were severe and often permanently disabling, with knights suffering brain damage, paralysis, and disfiguring injuries that ended their military careers, while leaving them unable to pursue alternative livelihoods. Tournament medicine consisted of basic wound treatment and prayer, with seriously injured knights often dying days or weeks after their injuries. Religious justification for tournaments was thin and often challenged by church authorities who recognized that these events were essentially murder for entertainment rather than legitimate military training. The church's attempts to ban or regulate tournaments were largely unsuccessful, because nobles enjoyed the spectacle too much to give it up for religious reasons. Chapter 8: Marriage and Family Life. Medieval Military Dynasties. Medieval knightly marriages were business partnerships designed to consolidate political power, combine military resources, and produce future generations of professional warriors. Love was considered irrelevant to arrangements that were essentially mergers between military enterprises disguised as romantic unions. Marriage negotiations involved detailed contracts specifying dowries, inheritance rights, and military obligations that would bind families together in political and economic alliances. Knights married for strategic advantage rather than personal compatibility, creating relationships that were often hostile or indifferent despite legal and religious requirements for cooperation. Dowry systems required knightly families to pay enormous sums to marry off their daughters while expecting to receive similar payments when their sons married. These financial obligations often bankrupted families who had to choose between providing adequate dowries and maintaining their military equipment and social status. Child-rearing in knightly families was designed to produce future generations of professional warriors through systematic conditioning that began in infancy. Children were separated from their parents at young ages and placed in other noble households where they could learn military skills and political loyalty while forming bonds that would support their future careers. Domestic violence was common in knightly marriages where men trained for violence often directed their aggression toward family members who had no legal protection or recourse. Knightly culture celebrated masculine aggression while providing no mechanisms for conflict resolution except violence, creating family environments characterized by fear and intimidation. Female roles in knightly families were limited to producing heirs, managing household economics, and maintaining social connections that might benefit their husbands' careers. Noble women had more legal rights than peasant women but were still considered property of their male relatives and had little control over their own lives or decisions. Economic management of knightly households required constant attention to military expenses, social obligations, and political relationships that determined the family's survival and success. Knightly wives often managed complex financial arrangements while their husbands were away on military campaigns or tournament circuits. Child mortality in noble families was high despite their wealth and resources, with parents expecting to lose several children to disease, accidents, or military training injuries. This created family dynamics where emotional attachment was limited and children were viewed as investments that might not survive to maturity. Inheritance disputes were common in knightly families where military equipment, land holdings, and political positions had to be divided among surviving heirs. These disputes often escalated into armed conflicts that destroyed families and created lasting feuds between relatives who had once been allies. Military obligations affected family life by requiring knights to spend months or years away from home while participating in campaigns, tournaments, and court service. This created families where fathers were absent figures and mothers were responsible for managing both household and military affairs. Educational priorities in knightly families focused entirely on military and political skills while neglecting intellectual development that might prepare children for alternative careers if military service became impossible or unprofitable. This narrow focus created generations of nobles who were unprepared for social and economic changes. Social expectations required knightly families to maintain expensive lifestyles that demonstrated their status while providing hospitality and entertainment for political allies. These social obligations consumed family resources while creating pressure to present appearances of prosperity even when finances were desperate. Chapter 9: Death and Legacy: How Knights Actually Died. Medieval knights died in ways that were far less romantic than literature suggests, usually succumbing to disease, accidents, or infections rather than heroic combat. The reality of knightly mortality reveals how dangerous and unhealthy their lifestyle was, even for people with access to the best medieval medicine and resources. Disease killed more knights than combat, with epidemic illnesses like plague, dysentery, and typhus regularly devastating military forces and noble households. Knights were particularly vulnerable to disease during military campaigns where they lived in unsanitary conditions while consuming poor food and contaminated water alongside hundreds of other men in similar circumstances. Accidents were common causes of knightly death, with riders being thrown from horses, crushed by falling equipment, or injured during training exercises that had no enemy combatants involved. The combination of heavy armor, large animals, and primitive safety measures made everyday knightly activities more dangerous than modern extreme sports. Infection from minor wounds killed many knights who survived initial injuries but died days or weeks later from blood poisoning caused by dirty weapons, inadequate wound care, and lack of effective medicine. A small cut could become gangrenous and fatal, making survival as much about luck as about avoiding serious injury. Tournament deaths were frequent and publicly witnessed, with knights dying from jousting accidents, melee injuries, and horse-related trauma, while crowds watched for entertainment. These deaths were considered acceptable casualties of knightly culture rather than tragic accidents requiring safety improvements or rule changes. Siege warfare claimed many knightly lives through starvation, disease, and gradual attrition rather than dramatic combat encounters. Knights trapped in besieged castles often died from malnutrition and illness while defenders and attackers engaged in prolonged warfare that favored neither side. Execution was a common end for knights who were captured during political conflicts or accused of treason against their feudal superiors. Political loyalty was conditional and could change rapidly, leaving knights vulnerable to death sentences based on shifting alliances rather than actual crimes or military failures. Suicide occurred among knights who suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, or other mental health conditions that medieval medicine couldn't diagnose or treat. The psychological toll of knightly life led some men to take their own lives rather than continue enduring physical and emotional suffering. Medical treatment for seriously injured knights was primitive and often counterproductive, with physicians using techniques like bloodletting and purging that weakened patients rather than helping them recover. Knights who might have survived with modern medical care died from treatments that were intended to help them. Old age was rare among knights, with most dying before age 40 from accumulated injuries, diseases, and the physical toll of wearing armor and fighting in combat for decades. The few knights who survived to old age were often disabled and impoverished, dependent on family charity or church welfare for survival. Burial practices for knights emphasized military identity over individual personality, with tombs featuring armor, weapons, and military achievements rather than personal characteristics or family relationships. Even in death, knights were remembered primarily for their capacity for violence rather than their humanity. Legacy preservation was difficult for knightly families whose wealth and status depended on successful military careers that could end suddenly through death or disability. Many knightly lineages lasted only a few generations before economic failure or military disaster ended their participation in noble society. Record-keeping of knightly deaths was often inadequate or biased, with chroniclers focusing on dramatic combat deaths, while ignoring the more common deaths from disease, accidents, and medical problems. This created historical narratives that misrepresented how knights actually lived and died. Chapter 10. The Psychology of Professional Violence. Medieval knighthood created a class of men who were systematically conditioned to commit violence while maintaining their sanity and social functioning. This psychological conditioning had devastating long-term effects that medieval society neither understood nor addressed, creating generations of traumatized warriors who struggled with what we would now recognize as severe mental health problems. Combat conditioning began in childhood and was designed to overcome natural human reluctance to kill other people. Young knights were taught to dehumanize their enemies through religious indoctrination, social conditioning, and repeated exposure to violence until killing became an automatic response rather than a moral choice requiring conscious decision-making. Dissociation was a common psychological defense mechanism among knights who needed to function normally in social settings while also being capable of extreme violence when required. This mental compartmentalization allowed knights to be loving fathers and devout Christians while also being efficient killers, but it created internal psychological conflicts that were never resolved. Alcohol dependency was endemic among knights who used drinking to cope with trauma, guilt, and the constant stress of their violent lifestyle. Medieval society provided no other methods for managing psychological pain, so knights self-medicated with whatever substances were available while their families and communities ignored the underlying problems. Religious extremism was common among knights who tried to resolve the contradiction between Christian teachings about peace and their professional requirement to commit violence. Some knights became obsessively devout, viewing their military service as religious crusading, while others rejected religion entirely as incompatible with their lived experience. Hypervigilance developed among knights who spent years expecting violent death at any moment, creating men who were constantly alert for threats even in peaceful settings. This chronic stress response made normal social interactions difficult and created knights who were jumpy, irritable, and prone to overreacting to minor provocations. Emotional numbing was necessary for knights who witnessed or participated in horrific violence on a regular basis. This psychological protective mechanism prevented overwhelming trauma, but also made it difficult for knights to form normal emotional attachments or experience positive emotions like joy and contentment. Sleep disorders plagued knights who experienced recurring nightmares, insomnia, and other sleep disturbances related to their combat experiences. Medieval medicine had no understanding of trauma-related sleep problems, so knights suffered through years of poor sleep that affected their physical health and mental stability. Aggression displacement occurred when knights who were trained to be violent had difficulty controlling their aggressive impulses in civilian settings. Domestic violence, tavern brawls, and unprovoked attacks on servants or peasants were common ways that knightly violence spilled over into non-military contexts. Social isolation affected knights who found it difficult to relate to people who hadn't shared their experiences of violence and trauma. This created a warrior subculture that was psychologically separate from the broader society it was supposed to protect, leading to an us versus them mentality that further damaged social relationships. Survivor guilt tormented knights who lived through battles that killed their friends and comrades, creating psychological burdens that medieval society had no framework for understanding or addressing. Knights blamed themselves for surviving when others died, leading to self-destructive behaviors and chronic depression. Identity confusion was common among knights whose entire sense of self was built around their military role and capacity for violence. When injury, age, or political changes ended their military careers, these men had no alternative identity to fall back on, leading to existential crises and psychological collapse. Chapter 11. The Myth-Making Machine. The romanticization of medieval knighthood was a deliberate propaganda campaign designed to make organized violence seem noble and heroic while obscuring the brutal realities of feudal warfare. This myth-making process created cultural narratives that persist today despite being completely disconnected from historical reality. Chivalric literature was written by clergy and court poets who had never experienced combat but needed to create ideological justification for the violent warrior class that dominated medieval society. These authors invented codes of honor, romantic adventures, and noble quests that bore no resemblance to actual knightly experience but served political purposes. Religious justification for knighthood was developed by church theologians who needed to reconcile Christian teachings about peace and love with the political necessity of maintaining armed forces. The concept of just war and Christian soldier was theological fiction designed to solve ideological problems rather than describe reality. Court culture created elaborate ceremonies, rituals, and social customs that made military violence seem civilized and refined. These cultural practices served to disguise the fact that knights were essentially professional killers by surrounding their activities with pageantry and protocol that suggested deeper meaning and purpose. Historical chronicles were written by people who served the same political and religious institutions that employed knights, creating biased accounts that emphasized heroic deeds while ignoring the mundane suffering that characterized most knightly experience. These chronicles became the source material for later Romantic interpretations. Artistic representation of knights in paintings, sculptures, and illuminated manuscripts deliberately portrayed them as noble heroes rather than traumatized warriors, creating visual propaganda that reinforced literary myths while providing no accurate record of how knights actually lived and died. Economic incentives encouraged the perpetuation of knightly myths because the warrior class needed to maintain social legitimacy to justify their privileged position and continued access to resources. Admitting that knighthood was economically destructive and socially harmful would have undermined the entire feudal system. Educational systems in medieval Europe were controlled by institutions that benefited from knightly culture, ensuring that literacy and learning reinforced rather than challenged the mythological understanding of warrior nobility. Alternative perspectives were suppressed or ignored to maintain ideological consistency. Legal frameworks supported knightly mythology by creating special privileges and protections for the warrior class while denying legal rights to people who might challenge knightly authority. The law itself became a tool for maintaining the fiction that knights were inherently superior to other social classes. Social pressure encouraged people to accept and repeat knightly myths rather than acknowledge the reality of warrior culture's negative effects on society. Challenging these myths was considered treasonous or heretical, making honest discussion of knightly problems dangerous for anyone who wasn't already powerful. Cultural transmission ensured that knightly myths were passed down through generations long after the actual military and social conditions that created knighthood had disappeared. These myths became part of European cultural identity rather than historical memory, making them resistant to factual correction. Modern perpetuation of knightly mythology continues through popular entertainment, educational materials, and cultural traditions that present medieval knights as romantic heroes rather than historical figures whose lives were characterized by violence, trauma, and economic exploitation. Chapter 12. The True Cost of Chivalric Culture. The social and economic costs of medieval knighthood extended far beyond the knights themselves, creating systemic problems that damaged entire societies while providing minimal benefits except to the small elite who profited from organized violence and social oppression. Resource allocation in knightly societies prioritized military expenses over productive investments, diverting enormous amounts of wealth from agriculture, crafts, trade, and infrastructure development into weapons, armor, and warrior maintenance that contributed nothing to general prosperity or social welfare. Labor exploitation was institutionalized through feudal systems that forced peasants to support knightly lifestyles through unpaid labor, military service, and economic tribute that prevented agricultural workers from accumulating wealth or improving their living conditions across multiple generations. Technological stagnation resulted from social systems that valued military prowess over innovation and learning, creating cultures that remained economically and technologically primitive compared to societies that invested in productive rather than destructive activities. Educational neglect was systematic in knightly societies where literacy and intellectual development were considered irrelevant or dangerous to maintaining social hierarchy. This created populations that remained ignorant and superstitious while other societies developed more advanced knowledge and skills. Legal oppression was built into feudal systems that gave knights judicial authority over people they also exploited economically, creating justice systems designed to maintain warrior privilege rather than provide fair treatment or social protection for vulnerable populations. Cultural violence was normalized through knightly ideologies that celebrated aggression, dominance, and the resolution of conflicts through physical force rather than negotiation, compromise, or social cooperation. This created societies where violence was the primary method for addressing problems. Economic inefficiency was endemic in systems that required enormous investments in military equipment and training that provided no productive return except through conquest and exploitation of other societies. Knightly economies were essentially parasitic rather than generative. Social instability resulted from power structures based on individual combat prowess rather than administrative competence, creating governments that were inherently unstable and prone to violent succession crises that disrupted economic and social development. Environmental destruction occurred when knightly societies exhausted local resources through warfare, overexploitation of forests for fuel and construction, and agricultural practices designed to support unsustainable population levels in castle towns and military encampments. International conflict was perpetuated by knightly cultures that viewed warfare as noble and necessary rather than as a social problem to be minimized through diplomacy and cooperation. This created European societies that were almost constantly at war with each other for centuries. Gender oppression was intensified in knightly societies where masculine violence was idealized while feminine qualities were devalued, creating gender hierarchies that were more extreme and oppressive than those found in societies with different military traditions. The ultimate legacy of medieval knighthood was centuries of European social development that prioritized violence over productivity, hierarchy over cooperation, and military glory over human welfare. The romantic myths surrounding knighthood have obscured the fact that chivalric culture was fundamentally destructive to human flourishing and social progress. Thanks for joining me on this comprehensive exploration of why medieval knighthood was actually a historical disaster disguised as noble tradition. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this thorough examination of chivalric reality, and let me know in the comments what other romanticized historical periods you'd like me to deconstruct with similar honesty. Until next time, stay grateful for living in an era where professional violence isn't considered the highest form of human achievement. And remember, the age of chivalry was a nightmare for almost everyone who experienced it, including the knights who were supposedly its greatest beneficiaries.